God, it looks very sunny where a lot of you are at the moment. I'm very jealous. If you saw outside my window, a typical Irish summer at the moment is about 12, 13 degrees Celsius and clouds. So it looks beautiful. I'm very jealous. Nearly I'd be drinking whiskey on a balcony like you guys if I had the same weather.
Every whiskey tastes much better here.
This is it, because people are happier with the sunshine. Although they often say bad weather is good for whiskey, because
but you know how it is with sunshine. You buy one shot and the second one is for free.
Yeah. Sure, I think, isn't that what they call us? Liquid sunshine, because we have no sunshine in Ireland, so we had to create it ourselves.
That's why it's called alchemy, right?
Alchemy, yeah, exactly. It's very, very true. So I hope you all have your little mini samples. I know obviously people who will be watching the recording may or may not have the whiskies in front of them. Don't worry, I'll be explaining what order we'll go through. And I think the biggest note is don't finish all your samples before we start. It's probably an important note to mention. We are drinking 5 whiskies tonight in the course of probably an hour and a half, 2 hours. So do remember, these are, give or take, 3 CL samples. We're talking roughly a shot or a measure. So we're having about 5 measures. I wouldn't be doing my job correctly if I didn't promote responsible drinking in some shape or form. So we have, I think, a couple more people still to join. I'm sure you're aware, Andre, but we have 34 at the moment in the...
Yes, I say let's give it one last minute, and I think we can start.
Cool.
Before, yes.
I'm also as well going to try and bring up... Oh, wow. That's such a change when you suddenly bring everybody onto gallery view. I also get to do this, and you see just all the wonderful faces. This is great. Oh, Maros, I see. Are you in Teeling? Oh, my God.
Yeah, I would love to, but unfortunately not.
You have to pick us up a bottle while you're there.
Yeah, no, I'm just downloaded the picture from the internet.
Nice. So
nice choice.
Just behind your
so
left...
you recognized it.
yeah, just behind your left-hand shoulder, there is a fill your own. So we've a couple of single casks.
Okay, I will take one.
Just grab it from behind you and pour it in your glass. But yeah, that's very cool.
300 euro, please.
Yeah, I was going to say you probably will need to get some of the other guys to go in halves or quarters with you to buy one. But worth every penny, tell you that.
Yeah, maybe sometimes.
But this year you made people can order through the internet to home.
I know.
You've been sending, because that years before I just need to went to the Teeling and I buy myself. But during the COVID time, you introduced the people can organize for them, and you can even write what you want for the label.
You can,
that's very nice.
Dangerously easy to buy whiskey now because of COVID. You literally go click. Oh, there's 7 whiskeys in my cart. Better not do that next week.
I really need to say it's absolutely excellent. The order of 100 euro you will send through the Europe for free. So that's excellent, because any of the new Teelings you put out and it's 100 euro, there is no extra charge for delivery, because we ordered with Thomas the new PX brandy chestnut finish. Straight away just came out.
Delicious whiskey.
2 months before there was some single cask and things like this one. Even I ordered distillery finish chestnut, because you have when you buy one bottle is 60 euro, when you buy 2 bottles is 120, and it's free delivery to Bratislava. Excellent deal.
Which is, it's and the thing is as well is, like, if I'm getting whiskey from any other country, typically I get distillery exclusives. I think that is so important when you're talking about Ireland, because, for example, Ireland in comparison to Slovakia, the taxes are so much higher on alcohol and cigarettes. So it's a great thing as well when you get that extra added bonus when you are getting something like a distillery exclusive. But no, it's very, very kind of you to say. It's good to hear the whiskey is still doing well despite all the challenges of the last, whatever, 18, 19 months. I'm just seeing if there is anybody else that I missed.
I think it's about time that
let's put the show on.
Yes, I suggest that we start.
Sure, I'll hand it over to Andre. So,
okay, thank you. So, hello everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Andrej Paholik. I'm the founder of Bratislava Whiskey Club, and I would like to welcome everyone here in this meeting and that is here with us tonight on this Teeling Masterclass. So first of all, please let me introduce to you our host, Chris Hayes. Chris is a European brand ambassador for whiskey, Teeling whiskey, and he will be leading this virtual tour and tasting of Teeling whiskey. So before we start, I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you to Chris for making this all happen tonight and for sending us the tasting packs for Bratislava Whiskey Club members. Also, I would like to say a huge thank you to the company Bameko, which is the official distributor of Teeling whiskey in Slovakia, for their support also in this event. If you are interested to buy Teeling whiskey, you can buy it in their shops called Delicatesso. I'm sure you know them. They're located in most of the malls, shopping malls in Slovakia. And they also have an e-shop, delicatesso.sk. And they were also so kind to provide us with a 10% discount code that can be used in their e-shop to order whiskey. The code is Teeling10 with capital letters. Let me maybe share one screen so to make it. Can you see the screenshot? Yes. So this is the e-shop, and the code is Teeling10. Okay. If you click submit, you will have a 10% discount on your orders. So it's good if you will like something that we'll be tasting tonight. All the samples are also available on the e-shop, so you can order. There are also much more expressions of Teeling. They're also with the Brabazon ones and a lot of them, so you can check it out and use the 10% discount code. I will be also sharing this code in the Bratislava Whiskey Club Facebook group for everyone. So feel free to share this and to use this. One last piece of information is that, as you are probably already aware, that this is being recorded and afterwards shared in the Bratislava Whiskey Club Facebook group. And I think that's probably enough of me talking. So I'm passing the virtual microphone to Chris, and let us all enjoy this special evening of Teeling.
Cheers, Andrew. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining and for watching this afterwards. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to you this evening about all things Teeling whiskey. As I'm sure you've all guessed, probably at this stage, I am Irish. So I'm from Dublin myself. I only live about 30 minutes from Teeling Whiskey Distillery. I don't know if many of you have been to Ireland or if you know Dublin, but where I'm based, I'm literally right beside the sea in a small area called Dunleary. So only about 30 minutes into the city centre. Now this evening, we've got an absolutely phenomenal lineup for you. I think myself and Andre both picked this lineup collectively, and we kind of had a lot of back and forth as to what would be the appropriate whiskies to present to you this evening. And I think the good thing about the lineup that we have is it's very, very diverse in the sense that you're going to taste a lot of different faces of Teeling whiskey. For example, some of our vintage reserve, some of our older stock that's coming from the old days, distilled in the 1980s up as far as the early 2000s. You'll be trying some of the newer stock. So what we're working on right now, kind of 2021 and even back last year, our brand new release, our Black Pits. We'll kind of give you an indication of what direction Teeling is going in the future, as well as, of course, some of our core range, some of our limited releases, like our collaborations. So we got a little bit of everything, which I think is a great way to set you up if you're not familiar with Teeling, or even if you are familiar with Teeling, to give you something a little bit special. So I'll try and cover everything from, a bit on brand history, who we are, what we're about, our ethos, I suppose all our marketing sides, a little bit on production, so we can kind of nerd out. And absolutely, if you've absolutely any questions, not just on the whiskey, but even outside of the whiskey, please feel free to interrupt me at any stage. You know, I know this is recorded, but I prefer to see it as more of a discussion rather than kind of a lecture. So don't be embarrassed. Don't be afraid. Ask me any questions you like, even if you want to know something as simple as, I don't know, where can I get the best Irish coffee in Dublin? I can give you plenty of recommendations. So just fire away with any questions, either typed or unmute yourself at any stage. And of course, we're going to jump into the whiskey pretty much straight away. So I'm sure everybody is very thirsty and looking forward to getting into this. So I'm not going to keep you waiting. I'm going to share my screen, and we're actually going to start with a whiskey before we get on to all the information. I'm sure everybody would kind of prefer it that way. So the first whiskey that we are going to be starting with this evening is our Teeling small batch. So if you want to take your small sample, I see some of you holding up to your screen. It's the first one that we're going to be pouring in and trying this evening. What I would recommend, try not to pour in the whole sample. I know I was joking about that earlier, but there is method to my madness. The reason being is that if you come to the end, you can always go back to your previous whiskies and see how the flavor tasted after you've had a couple of others. You know, it is going to change as we go along. So typically, you know, I would say pour 2/3 of it, pour about 20 mils or 2 CLs into your sample. Unless you're like myself and you've already started before we launch this presentation, but we're talking just a small amounts. So this is kind of an introduction into Teeling whiskey. This is our flagship whiskey, the Teeling small batch. This is of course available in 70 international markets all around the world. It's really our bread and butter. It's part of our core range. You know, this is really what Teeling is all about in a nutshell. So this, at the base, it is a premium blend. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking. Blended whiskey, when we talk about this worldwide, still tends to have a little bit of a stigma attached to it. You know, particularly when we put it in comparison to, say, single malt, or even in Ireland when we talk about single pot still. In terms of its kind of prestige, it's often seen as, I suppose, an inferior style to single malt or even single pot still. And this is something that Teeling really wanted to debunk, you know, from the get-go. Create a very high quality spirit with a ton of complexity, really focusing on the quality rather than the quantity, which I think is very much the norm with a lot of mass-produced blended whiskey. So for starters, the small batch means smaller production. You know, it is a very relative term from one company to the next. Small batch could mean 100,000 casks, or small batch could mean 100 casks. Now, to us, we hand select between about 55 to 75 barrels every single time we make this whiskey. And we refine, we change the recipe roughly about every 12 to 18 months. So we don't have, you know, a formula. We don't have, I suppose, the same process of how we make this whiskey. We change it up every single time. Now, in terms of its actual structure, it's 3 parts corn, 1 part barley. So we're talking approximately 75% corn to 25% malt, aged in bourbon casks first for up to 6 years, and then finished in Central American rum casks for about 12 months in total. So coming from a variety of different regions, Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, we've even been sourcing the likes of agricole rum and pineapple rum, so other styles to constantly refine this recipe. So if you think about it, the very first whiskey of tonight that we're trying, if this whiskey is 46% rum casks and non-chill filtered, I think this is really an indication of how different all the whiskeys you are going to try tonight. But that's enough said about the whiskey. Cheers, everybody. Sláinte. Enjoy your first one. Thank you so much for having me. So in a similar way to if you have absolutely any questions, I'd also love to hear your own personal feedback on the whiskey, your own tasting notes, whether you love the whiskey, whether you hate the whiskey. That is just as interesting to me. So I, of course, will give you my own personal tasting notes, and you'll see now in a minute some of the kind of official brand ones, but I kind of tend to go off my own experience, what I get from the whiskey itself. So starting off a little bit more generally, typically most Irish whiskey is bottled at 40% ABV. Typically, it is matured in bourbon casks, sherry casks, or port. And historically, it will be chilled filtered. So already we're moving away from that traditional archetype of 46% non-chill filtered and rum casks. For me, the rum is really interesting in the sense that we did a lot of tests at the start. And I've been working with Teeling pretty much since day one. I'll explain, as I said, all the brand very shortly. But basically, we started in 2015 as a functioning distillery. I was with Teeling since early 2016. And we tested this whiskey a number of different times. So there was a total of 7 recipes that we were trying out before we were happy with the final results. The rum for me adds a ton of complexity because we initially get that inherent sweetness that you'll get, say, from an Irish blended whiskey, the honeysuckle, the maple syrup, the toffee, and of course, those high ripe fruits like apples, dates, even pears and apricots. But on top of that, you tend to get a lot more of the tropical fruits. So if you think of the likes of pineapple or even mango, will be 2 of the big flavor profiles on the nose, as well as sultanas or raisins. So really, you know, jumps from the glass at 46% and because of that rum influence. Now, if you're not getting the tropical fruits, again, this is just going off my own palate and my own experiences with whiskey. I tend to pick up a lot of citrus from this particular release. So either if you think of orange marmalade, so we're kind of leaning into like old fashioned territory with the cinnamon spice and the citrus, or I think it's more lime skins. Really depends what time of day you're drinking it or what it's like at the moment. Say, for example, if you're in your backyard drinking it, it might taste a little bit different to if you're in your sitting room. So that's our Teeling small batch. As I said, let me know what you think about it. I'd love to hear your own feedback. To show you, as I said, the official breakdown of the tasting notes. On the nose, a little bit of spice, bit of sweetness, and those tropical fruits. It can tend to also be slightly herbal. So in particular, if you think of like dandelion root or fennel, the taste has this very thick, creamy mouthfeel. So a lot of viscosity, again, coming through from the non-chill filtration. Like I'm sure you all know well at this stage, non-chill filtration keeps in the acids, the fatty acids, the oils, the texture of the whiskey. And that's why you're getting that really big, really rounded mouthfeel from this particular whiskey. Finish very light, very accessible. And it's why I wanted to start with a small batch. I'm assuming that it's your first whiskey of the day. And I think if it is the first whiskey of the day, you know, we'll start off with something relatively light and very, very easy going. But in terms of, you know, money for value, for me, this is really one of the best sellers at Teeling. It actually makes up 70% of our global sales. So it's a very, very important kind of starting off point for Teeling Whiskey Company. So I'm going to let you nurture that away. As I said, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me at any stage. We're going to start off now this evening with a bit of background on, of course, who Teeling Whiskey are. So what we're all about, what makes Teeling Whiskey, I suppose, an award-winning premium world-class brand that started only just shy of 6 years ago as an active distillery. So at the moment, I don't know if many of you are aware of this, maybe you are, maybe you aren't, but Irish whiskey is going through this incredibly interesting transformation in the sense that since the early 2000s, and even despite a global pandemic, Irish whiskey is still one of the fastest growing spirits in the world. It's actually doubling in terms of percentage growth. Now, you only have to look at your local, let's say, liquor store or supermarket or bar to really get an indication of how fast Irish whiskey is growing, because the number of brands is constantly increasing. To give you a figure, at the moment in Ireland, there is 38 fully functional distilleries across the whole country in different levels of production. So 38 is massive in comparison to just only in the 1980s. So, you know, not too long ago, there was only 3 distilleries in the whole country. And this is going to be 50 in the next 10 years. Now, Teeling, where we kind of sit in this general history of Irish whiskey, Teeling was the first new distillery in Dublin, in the capital, in 125 years. So says you, why is that relevant? Why is that important? Originally, Dublin was a very, very integral part for the production of Irish whiskey. not just in terms of the volume, but also in terms of the brands. So for example, some of the largest, some of the most prominent distilleries in the world, not just in Ireland, were based out of Dublin. One perfect example, and I know that absolutely 100% of you will have heard of them, Jameson. So Jameson was actually originally based in Dublin in a small area called Smithfield. It's just on the other side of a big river that runs through Dublin called the River Liffey, about 15 minutes from Teeling. And they were actually originally based in Dublin. Whereas now, if you go to the Jameson distillery, you have to go to the south of Ireland, down to Middleton in Cork. On top of Jameson, you have the likes of Powers, DWD, Jones Road Distillery. Some of these you'll know, some of them you probably won't. But again, these were very big producers with a very prestigious name globally, not just in Ireland. So back in the day, there was a number of distilleries in the capital. The idea with Teeling is that we're looking to bring whiskey back to Dublin. Revive this long-standing tradition of urban distillation, but do it with a modern approach. So I know I've talked a little bit about history, but Teeling is not necessarily a historical brand. We're much more of a liquid-led company. We more care about what is in your glass is the most important thing, rather than talking about hundreds of years of provenance and history. But that's kind of to give you a bit of a background into where we come into place. So we're very much part of this next generation, if you will, of whiskey producers. Now, the company itself, owned by two brothers, you can see them there on my screen, Jack and Stephen Teeling. They set up Teeling Whiskey Company in 2012. They basically started off in the Irish whiskey industry in the 1980s. So as I said to you, in the 1980s, Irish whiskey was pretty much non-existent. It only represented 2% of global whiskey sales. There was only 3 distilleries, and it was really just nothing in comparison to Scotch. At this time, the Teeling brothers, they worked with their father, basically a man called John Teeling, and they worked in Ireland's only independent distillery at the time. So this distillery, you may or may not know it, it's called the Cooley Distillery. It produced some absolutely phenomenal Irish whiskies that I'm certain that you know. One, for example, is Connemara. So many of you guys heard of Connemara before today. I'm sure you have. Yeah, see a couple shaking your heads. Connemara, of course, still one of the only, peated Irish single malts on the global market. Something that is very gladly, I am to say, changing at the moment. But also Cooley included Kilbeggan. Kilbeggan, one of the oldest Irish whiskey brands, dates back many, many centuries. Now, the Teeling brothers, where their story begins, is they sold this old distillery in the 1980s. So they sold it off to Jim Beam, and they decided to keep about 16,000 barrels to set up in Dublin and create their own company from scratch. So that's to say, if you're wondering, and I'm sure some of you will ask me this question, Chris, how do we have 18-year-old whiskey, 30-year-old whiskey, 6-year-old whiskey when you've only been around since 2012 as a brand? The answer is that we're taking from that old family reserve from the Cooley Distillery in the 1980s, which was owned and run by the Teeling family. So that's a very interesting changeover that you're seeing now in Teeling's history, where, for example, tonight we will be trying one of our brand new releases that was distilled 100% in our new distillery in Dublin, the Teeling Black Pits, which is our first peated, triple distilled peated single malts. I see some eyebrows raising. The final thing I will say before we get on to the next whiskey is everything that I've talked about. So all of this history, but taken with a modern approach, is all embodied through the logo of our distillery. Of course, the Phoenix. The idea of, not only representing the revival of Irish whiskey, but also the revival of the Teeling family name. So you will see, if you have any of our bottles at home, and if you look at, say, particularly the left-hand side of your bottle, for example, this is our classic single malt. On the left-hand side, you'll see 1782. Now, 1782 refers to the ancestors of Teeling whiskey. So the very furthest we can go back with the family name distilling in Dublin was in 1782. You can see on my screen, there was a man called Walter Teeling. He basically had a small craft distillery in this area where we're now built. But really, the family name was reborn. The brand was restarted in 2012 when we set up Teeling Whiskey Company. So that's pretty much, all the branding. But I think what's the most important thing is how does it actually taste? Do you like it? Do you not like it? That to me is kind of the most interesting thing. So the next whiskey we are going to be moving on to is our amber ale. Now, out of interest, sorry, go ahead, Andre.
Yes, just one question, so I didn't forget. Since you already mentioned the logo and the date on the logo, so I would like to ask that we noticed that on some of the bottlings of Teeling, on the older ones, there is this since 1700 this year.
82,
and,
yeah.
Yes, but on the new ones, especially on those that are distilled 100% in Teeling, it changes that reborn 2012. So does this change in logo mean that those bottles that have this reborn 2012 are distilled in the Teeling and not in Cooley? Or is there some correlation between these?
It's a really good question, Andre. Yeah, so the short answer is yes and no. For example, our single malt is still, and our single grain are still coming from the family reserve. We actually don't have column stills in Teeling. Could we expand and create column stills in the future? Potentially, but right now we don't have any column stills. So our single grain, for example, is still coming from our family reserve. By comparison, the single pot still or the small batch, the malted component in both of those is now coming from Dublin. So the 2012 was less a signifier as to where the stock was coming from and more a rebranding of the core range now that we have firmly established ourselves as a whiskey company with our first release. You know, I think often you can classify a whiskey brand as a global whiskey brand if they reach a certain number of sales. I think it depends on the company. A lot of people say about 1.2 million cases. But also I think, you know, a very valid distillery is when they have their own commercial available release. So once we had the single pot still, we very much wanted to rebrand just the core range and have that as 2012 rather than talking about all this history going forward. It's the idea. But yeah, it's a very, very good question. Anybody else have anything you'd like to know?
So this means that in some time, all of the core bottlings will have this change to the reborn, regardless of whether this is coming from the Teeling distillery or from Cooley.
So the aim is to have ideally the core range eventually all coming from Dublin. But they will all have 2012 going forward in the future. You will also notice as well, and it's just a small signifier, but you will also notice let me see if I have a bottle here, a small phoenix etched on the back is also an indication, where some of the older bottlings don't actually have this.
Okay, perfect, thank you very much.
No problem at all. So yeah, out of the first two whiskies, the reason that I wanted to put the amber ale second is the base of this whiskey is actually the same as the first one. So I don't know if many of you are big beer aficionados. I think it's probably a silly question in that most people who are into whiskey are probably into beer in some shape or form. But this is a collaboration we actually did with an Irish, more specifically a Dublin brewery called Dot Brew. One of my favorite craft beers at the moment, not just in Ireland, but around the world. I've been drinking their stuff for many, many years. They're run by an absolute incredibly talented man called Shane Kelly. And he specializes a lot in barrel-aged beers. So he would use everything from tequila casks, Irish single malt, rum, you name it. He probably has it somewhere in his rack house. And he's doing a lot of incredible kind of specialty beers that are all barrel-aged. This particular product is part of a series at Teeling. So it's called our small batch collaborations. So if you haven't done so already, do make sure to pour yourself a little bit of your second whiskey. And if you, like myself, are very lazy and only using one glass stupidly, make sure to rinse out your glass with a little bit of water. If not, I would recommend using different glasses. So as I said, the small batch collaborations, the idea behind this is that we wanted to do cask exchanges with different companies from all around the world. So if you think of the likes of wineries, distilleries, breweries, gin distillers, rum distillers, anything. Predominantly, we wanted to work with companies who, A, shared the same ethos as ourselves. So who are forward-thinking, who are focused on flavor rather than on the marketing elements, rather than selling whiskey, and really wanted to look for new flavors within their own respective categories. So our master distiller, master blender, who I'll introduce you to a little bit later on, he wanted to show that Irish whiskey could be a great canvas to take on other flavors. Now, how do we show that Irish whiskey is, good quality without awards or without, people's feedback? His kind of idea is that by testing it with a variety of different casks was the initial idea. So anything from tequila, rum, beer, schnapps, aquavit, vermouth, you can think of it, it's probably somewhere in our warehouse. Like at the moment, we have over 100 different expressions in our warehouses about 50 kilometers from Dublin. If you want to know the true meaning of innovation, go to the back of the warehouse. You'll see things you probably never even heard of before in the Irish whiskey industry. And this was where the collaboration started off. So we first looked at different styles of rum to test the quality of our spirit. Like originally, the small batch, as I said, is predominantly from different regions around Central America, but it was mostly Spanish style rum. And we started to look at agricole rum and different flavored rums as an extension of this. Now, at the same time, we looked at breweries. As we know, whiskey and beer, particularly whiskey and dark beer, are two pairings that work exceptionally well. So one of our first collaborations was with an Irish brewery using stout casks. Now, this is a slightly later edition with Dot Brew using amber ale. So amber ale, it's a style of beer where they've amber malt. Typically, it's kilned at slightly higher temperature. But essentially, the main flavors you're looking for are toffee, caramel. Depending on what hops they use, it might be quite fruit forward. So you might have, again, those like mango or pineapple notes, depending on if they're using like contemporary hops, or it might just be very sweet and very sugary. So let me know what you think anyway, personally. Again, 46%, non-chill filtered, natural color. So no E150A, no added colorings. Cheers, everybody. Sláinte.
I just can't stop nosing it. It's amazing.
I'm delighted to hear. Sorry, who said that? I'll pull off my screen.
The smell is pretty nice. Yeah.
The smell is amazing. I just cannot stop nosing it.
And it was, I think it was a very good idea to put this second after the small batch, because really here it shows the difference and the beer character, because I had this sample before, and I didn't notice the beer character so much as now when I have it after the small batch, which is the base of it. So right now I really can sense the hops.
Oh no, I'm delighted to hear. Yeah, and I think it's so striking, isn't it? Like these whiskeys, the biggest difference is the cask finishing. You know, it is still 75% corn, 25% malt and barley, 6 years in bourbon. But then instead of using rum casks, it's in these amber ale barrels for approximately about 15 months. And you're dead right. I get a ton of so the hops that he's using is, as far as I can recall, it's Amarillo and Galaxy. So with those, you're getting a lot of the pineapple, mango, kind of juicy fruits. But the heavy toffee notes coming through from the barley, not just from the whiskey and the beer, is incredible. Like I would happily have this as a perfume. I don't know about yourselves. It just smells absolutely incredible. And if you're into beer, you know, immediately you will distinguish this as a beer-influenced Irish whiskey.
There's a Czech brewery using the Galaxy hops, and it's very, very close to this. Really.
Really? What's the name of the brewery?
It's called Matuszka.
Matuszka. I'm gonna take a note of it. As you probably guessed, Michael, I am a bit of a beer nerd, as much as a whiskey aficionado. I actually brew my own beer at home. Yeah, there's some great Czech breweries now out there at the moment. Garden Brewery is they're Croatian, but no, there's some really great crafts. You said Czech, did you?
I did.
Okay, Matuszka. I'm going to take a note of that.
Matuszka.
Cheers, thank you. So yeah, any other tasting notes you guys are getting? We've already mentioned the hops. Anybody getting anything in particular that we haven't mentioned?
It's like a caramel toffee. I can't help it, but the smell is really like a good caramel toffee. It's just,
is that yourself?
Overall,
Peter,
caramelish. Yep.
It's a really. How are you? Yeah, it's a really good observation. So I still don't know exactly where that's coming from, and I've asked Alex, and it can be coming from one or two places. Well, nearly three. One is coming through from the high corn content. So this is 3 parts corn And typically corn will deliver flavors like caramel, toffee, fudge. It can also technically come from the beer. So amber malt, it is made with amber. Amber ale is made with amber malt, and normally it is a little bit sweeter. So it could potentially be coming from the beer as well, or it could be coming from the bourbon. But wherever it's coming from, I agree with you. It's absolutely delicious, like burnt caramel or toffee on the nose.
What I get is aniseed, like really quite significant aniseed.
That's a really good one. Yeah, like aniseed or cinnamon. I don't know which for me personally, but I see what you mean. And again, I know 100% that is coming true because as I said, I know the brewery quite well, and I was chatting to Shane about his beer, and that is more so coming from the beer influence, the aniseed, fennel, rather than from the whiskey base. So today, sorry, go ahead.
So it's really so sad that they are not producing perfumes based on the whiskey, because it will be a very good one.
Not yet, Milos.
It's really delicious.
I'm going to be a millionaire this time next year, starting my own aromatizer. But one thing you can do, and this is just for fun, I often do this test with people and in-person tastings. If you have a little bit left in your whiskey and you want to kind of see the effect of non-chill filtration, or really look at the natural oils of a whiskey, one thing that you can do, and this is completely optional, is you can take a little bit of your whiskey, so put your hand on top of your glass, rub it over into your hands, and you can rub it together like a perfume. Let's not forget the distillation process of perfume and whiskey, not too dissimilar. There's also similar ingredients like bergamot, citrus oils. There's a lot of ingredients in perfume that you'll find in whiskey. But if you rub your hands together, the heat from your body will allow a lot of the aromas to come through. And what you can do, make a funnel, bring it up to your nose, and smell the whiskey that way. So you'll see it rubs in like a hand cream. It's
really interesting. I have never seen anything like this. So do with the hands and the whiskey, and it's really interesting.
Of course, the best thing you can do afterwards, rub a little bit on your hands and neck at the ends. You'll have some Irish whiskey perfume.
Yeah, the same procedure is used for checking the quality of Slivovica. Slivovitz. Like if it's fruity or nice nose, then it's a quality product. But if you smell more alcohol,
more ethanol,
then it's not that good.
Yeah, it's a really interesting taste, because again, you'll often see people doing this, heating up their glass. Heat does have an important component on releasing some of the aromas. That's not to say that I recommend you putting your whiskey in a saucepan and heating it up. Please do not do that. But I think you can do sort of simple tests like this. So yeah, let's see what the actual official tasting notes. I definitely agree with you with the aniseeds. Now let's see what the actual official ones are. So rum, raisin, tropical notes, a little bit of candied apples, anise, licorice. And again, it's a funny one, isn't it? There's certain flavor profiles that if you like eating or if you like drinking those things, you will instantly pick them up. For example, me personally, I detest licorice. It's just one of those flavors that I don't enjoy. And as a result, me personally, I struggle to pick it up in a whiskey or in an alcohol product. Whereas, you can take another example. If you think of celery, celery is a great example. Some people love it, some people hate it. And again, that's another example of flavors that what you're used to will dictate what you pick up in an alcohol product. But absolutely, the aniseed is dead right. Slightly herbaceous. For me, there's a lot of cinnamon or gingerbread on the finish. It does have that little bit of a spice, which I think is nice coming through from the beer. So I hope you enjoyed the second one. That's the amber ale. The only downside about this whiskey is, of course, it is a limited release. The brewery themselves, they made, of course, a beer matured in our whiskey barrels. So if you do want to try to source the beer as well as the whiskey, I can absolutely tell you where you can find it. Really, really great brewery. Moving away from the whiskey for a second and coming back to I suppose, Teeling as a brand. As I mentioned to you, when we set up as a company, it was in 2012, but our ancestors go back many, many centuries, back as far as the 18th century. So in 1782 was when the Teeling family first kind of started distilling in Dublin. Now, around this time, again, you may be aware of it, you may not be aware of it, this was predating the stage where Irish whiskey was one of the most sold spirits, not just whiskey, one of the most sold spirits in the world. Of course, this is referring to the golden era of Irish whiskey. So you've probably heard this from every Irish whiskey representative where they talk about how good Irish whiskey used to be and how it's making a comeback. It is the truth. Back in the 19th century, Irish whiskey actually represented 70% of global whiskey sales. So it outsold Scotch 3-1 back in the 19th century. It was really a dominant force around the world. Dublin, as I mentioned to you, was really important in terms of the production of whiskey. So originally, 37 active distilleries. Now in Ireland, in the whole country, there is just over 37. So 38 distilleries in Ireland. Imagine 37 distilleries in one city. Like imagine in Bratislava, imagine 37 whiskey distilleries. How much production will be going on? It would be incredible. Any city around the world. Unfortunately, these all closed. So 100% of them closed. What happened in the 60s was you had a lot of distilleries kind of pooling together and forming Irish distillers, which are based down in the south of Ireland. The last distillery to shut down in Dublin was in the 70s. So of course, you've probably all heard the typical stories of why Irish whiskey sort of fell off the face of the earth. A lot of people tend to blame prohibition, or they talk about, changes in technology, or maybe even political reasons. In Ireland, the demise of Irish whiskey started well before the 19th century. So there were kind of elements that were creeping up throughout history that had a very sort of negative effect on how it was sold. For example, religion had a very important impact on how and where Irish whiskey was sold. There was a man called Father Theobald Matthews who basically got 1 in 3 Irish people to stop drinking whiskey during the 18th century. So he created something called a pledge where you signed your name and you basically said you weren't going to drink alcohol or spirits. And that had a devastating effect on the domestic Irish whiskey industry, even before prohibition or Ireland becoming a republic or any of that. But regardless of whoever we put the blame on, if it's prohibition or if it's changes in technology, the Irish whiskey at the moment is starting to go through, as I said, a really interesting transformation. Like if you look just in the 1980s or even in the early 2000s, there was only 3 active distilleries across the whole country. And these are probably the brands that you all know, today. I'm sure 99% of you have heard of Jameson, have heard of Tullamore Dew, have heard of Bushmills, maybe Connemara, maybe some of the other ones like Tyrconnell. But in general, we kind of knew Irish whiskey through 3 producers. Whereas now, if you look at Irish whiskey in 2021, 2020, 38 active distilleries. And if you look just around Dublin, how much that has changed. There's now 4 active distilleries in Dublin. Teeling, of course, was the first. So the next time you do come to Dublin, please feel free to give me a call. I'll bring you around all the different distilleries. We could do a Dublin whiskey tour, stopping off on pubs on the way. But it's really great to see, not just for brands like Teeling, but also for the whole category, that there's lots of newer producers kind of bringing breadth and choice to Irish whiskey. So as I said, I wasn't going to talk too much about history, and I've already gone against my words, but just to, I suppose, touch on how Teeling has grown within those 5 years. Like Irish whiskey has changed massively. How has Teeling changed within those 5 years? We've now just celebrated our 6th anniversary as an active distillery, so we're starting to get old. We are now available, of course, all around the world, as I mentioned, 70 different countries. But within that time, for me, the 2 most interesting things is first, how much whiskey we've distilled. Nearly 3 million litres of Dublin distilled whiskey within that time. So if you like, the black pits, or if you like the single pot still, or even if you like the ones we're trying tonight, the good news is there's going to be a lot more of this coming in the future. This is only the kind of the early days, the starting point of Teeling whiskey. I have a lot of friends who work, and I've worked for the bigger brands as well. And it's very exciting when you have these whiskeys that have hundreds of years of history behind them. But it also can be a little bit difficult when you're talking about, producers that are long gone and dead. Whereas at the other side of the coin, it's very exciting to talk about a company who is just starting and is really only finding their strides. The second thing is, since we've set up as a brand, we have won over 300 international awards, including in 2019, the best single malt in the world. So that was our 24-year-old. Unfortunately, I'm crying. We're not able to try it tonight. We don't have any stock at the moment. It's just the honest answer. If we did, we'd be tasting it right now. It was our 10% peated, matured in Sauternes wine casks, and 46%. None of those things are what we think about Irish whiskey. Not a single thing. Peated, high ABV, and Sauternes dessert wine really kind of turned Irish whiskey on its head. But that was the first time an Irish distillery has ever won this award. When you think about all of the wonderful whiskey, at the start of this masterclass, we were talking about the Spot range or Redbreast or even Jameson, phenomenal whiskies, but have unfortunately never gotten that high accolades for whatever reason. So that's to just give you a bit of an indication of our growth within the last 5 or 6 years. Hopefully it continues on the up. One whiskey that I think is quite important in terms of how it's changed. Now, this is also part of our core range. It's our classic single malt. So if you haven't done so already, dust off your amber ale, and we're going to jump into the single malt. I don't know if you can see that at all. So I'll be very interested to hear what you have to say about this particular product, in the sense that, I'm just seeing what you're holding at the bottom, and is that what I think it is?
Yeah, that is what you think it is.
Oh, wow.
This is the first whiskey what won best whiskey in the world. First time the Irish whiskey had.
Incredible. So we
24-year-old. That's the one.
24 years old, Sauternes cask. Yeah.
So we know where the after party is anyway.
This was the whiskey which made a history. Then you have any other year, but this was the first one. So,
quick question for you: is it opened or is it unopened?
It's prepared for the tasting.
Nice.
I bought because I want to open.
Very good. No, I've absolutely no problem with people collecting whiskey. I was just curious because it looks like it's in very good condition. The interesting thing about the 24-year-old is that actually started as an experiment. So we had a 21-year-old single malt, and our master distiller, who I will introduce you to in a second, he sourced these Sauternes wine casks. So Sauternes, it's a dessert wine from the south of France in Bordeaux. And basically they allow bacteria to build up on the grapes. It's called botrytis. And this creates a very high, sort of sweet, intensified dessert wine. Now, Alex Chasko, our master distiller, he sought these casks and decided to transfer a 21-year-old single malt, well-established good whiskey, into Sauternes. Jack and Stephen thought he was absolutely mad. They're like, what are you doing? This whiskey is ready to go. It's 21 years. Don't mess with this. And obviously, I think it goes to show Alex stuck to his guns, and it turned out to be an incredible whiskey. So this was the 21-year-old from Teeling, small percent of peated malt, so under 10%. And then we aged it for a little bit longer so 3 years in Sauternes to become the Teeling 24-year-old. That now has evolved even further into our 28-year-old, and we will be releasing further down the line a 32-year-old edition of this same whiskey. So that Sauternes influence is really important for our kind of future stock. The way we see the whiskey process, and I think this is how a lot of people treat it, is almost like a learning process. taking the losses and taking the wins and applying them to how you make whiskey going in the future. We're not looking at making whiskey now in 2020. We're looking at how it should be made in 2050. And that's kind of the prerogative of our team here. But the Sauternes is very, very important for the next whiskey that we're going to be trying. So before we get onto that, the single malt, for me, this is really interesting in that it really embodies what our master distiller, and I'm going to introduce you to him now, what our master distiller, Alex Chasko, is all about as a master distiller, master blender. Alex, he's a really interesting background in the sense that before he became a master distiller, he was actually a master brewer. So what he's doing is he's taking a lot of his brewing background, so his knowledge of specialty grains, his extensive knowledge of fermentation, and really bringing that to the whiskey process in particular, which I think is fascinating. He's experimenting a lot with different grain varieties that typically you will find all the time in craft beer, but that you will never find in the whiskey industry. For example, just to give you one out of many that I could give you, at the moment we're experimenting with what's called chocolate malt. So chocolate malt, it's an ingredient that's used in dark beers, porters, stouts, imperial stouts, black IPAs. It's barley that has been malted but then roasted. So it smells and tastes like dark chocolate, essentially. And this is never used or very seldom used within the whiskey industry. The reason being... Cygnus, yes. And I'm delighted that you know it. Pretty much the only example on the global whiskey market at the moment. As I said, this is just one example. We're experimenting with amber malt, crystal malt. Crystal malt sounds like something else, but it is a type of cereal. And all of these ingredients that typically you'll find in beer rather than in whiskey. So Alex, he's from Portland, Oregon, from America, from the States. He's been with Teeling from day one. He was actually our first employee, and he worked with the Teeling family back in the 1980s at the Cooley Distillery. So he was our head of innovation, was his title back in the 1980s. The reason I say the single malt is a really good example of Alex's sort of skill is this whiskey is actually aged in 5 different wine casks. So white wine Burgundy, Cabernet Sauvignon, Madeira, Port, and Oloroso Sherry. It's one of the few whiskeys in the world that's matured in that number of different casks. And it really goes to show Alex's skill as a master blender, not just as a master distiller. So you can see the breakdown there. Have a taste of it. Let me know what you guys think. I'll be really interested to hear tasting notes because with this whiskey, there's no wrong answer. Because it's matured in 5 wine casks, you're literally going to taste everything under the sun. So cheers, everybody. I'm trying to remember is it Nastravia? Or if not, Sláinte in Irish. Cheers, everybody.
Nazdravie.
Nazdravie. There's a lot of green apple notes for me there. Also vanilla. And it's much more full-bodied compared to the small batch. It really shows the difference here. And I want to ask that how the percentage of how much of this is actually distilled in Teeling, or it's all distilled in Teeling, or there's some also Cooley stock there?
No, so at the moment, if it was in that situation, it would have to be a double malt, because obviously coming from 2 sites, whereas it is still a single malt. So this is one of these small challenges that we face. Either we're going to have to go calling it a double malt, which as we all know has the negative connotations. B, we have to move towards 100% stock in Dublin, which me personally, I think would be very interesting. We're hitting around that 6-year mark. Or C, continue to use the family stock, which is what we're doing right now. But no, to answer your question, that's coming from the family reserve. In terms of percentages of the cask, I'll tell you when we tried it a little bit more. So green apple and, sorry, what was the other tasting notes you were saying?
Vanilla.
Vanilla. Any of the rest of you guys?
Yeah, I smell whiskey.
This is it. At the end of the day, as long as it smells like whiskey, if it smells like something else,
the really strong smells. Yeah,
One interesting thing I got when I put the glass to my nose for the first time was grist.
Grist.
Like you could even identify, and it brings you back. If you have been to a distillery before, this
Yeah.
like environment around you and all the nice stuff. So it's very nice. Yeah.
I know what you mean. It has that. It's not quite cooked grains, but it is just that fresh barley sort of aroma. And again, let's not forget, this is a completely different style. This evening, the only style, or the two styles that we're trying, are single malt and blended whiskey. We do also have grain whiskey, as you can see here behind me, the Teeling single grain and pot still. But with single malts, malted barley is going to give more viscosity, it is going to give a longer finish typically, and it is going to feel a little bit more full bodied. I often like to give the example, if you compare like a Cabernet Sauvignon or a Riesling, both are good wines, but it depends on the situation. It depends what you like. Or if you think of a stout and a lager, I often say a lager is like a grain whiskey. It's very crisp and refreshing and easygoing. Is a lager better or worse than a stout? Depends on your own personal preference. But so grist, some apple, some vanilla. Anybody
citrus.
getting chocolate out of interest, like dark chocolate or coffee?
I would say yellow melon.
Melon, yeah. Now, do you mean like, this is getting very specific, but do you mean like honeydew melon, like sweet melon, or like cantaloupe?
Cantaloupe melon.
Cantaloupe, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. And I don't know about yourself, but melon is one of those flavors that I love in whiskey. It's just if I smell melons in whiskey, I'm like immediately drawn to it. Again, I think it's just something that I personally love to eat. Like if you think about it, if you have like a melon and a bit of Parma ham, so good. So like if there's a bit of saltiness and melon in a whiskey, I'm sold. Really, really am. The dark chocolate though is a funny one in the sense that sometimes you get it and sometimes you don't. Like it nearly comes in waves. So it's predominantly coming from the Oloroso sherry. To show you the breakdown of the cask, so Oloroso sherry and port, two different components that could potentially give you dark chocolate or coffee. With Oloroso sherry, typically it's going to have more of that mustiness, more the sort of robust flavors in comparison, say, to Pedro Jimenez, which would be more fresh fruits, more lighter in general. And again, stone fruits will be a big one. So if you think of sultanas, plums, apricots, or even nectarine on the nose. But I think the great thing about this whiskey is, I nearly could have sent you 5 samples of the same whiskey, and I wouldn't have been that mean, but we probably would have distinguished different things in each glass, thinking they were all different whiskeys, and I could have just used the single malt. It is incredibly complex. So this whiskey, similar to the small batch, we make it every kind of 12 to 18 months. The percentage of casks varies from year to year, from batch to batch. So typically the backbone would be the Oloroso sherry. You'd be talking somewhere around 50, 60%. And then the other 40% will be divided between your 4 other wine casks. So your Cab Sav, your Madeira, white wine Burgundy, and port. As I said, the way that we work, we don't go off a set ratio or set percentage. I'm more based off the quality of the liquid. So it will change if you have a bottle of single malt at home from, say, what's my bottle here? 2018, or if you've one from 2020, they will actually taste slightly different. And I think for, consumers like yourselves and even someone who's interested in whiskey like myself, I think that's more interesting. That whiskey evolves and it develops rather than being the exact same thing every single time, no matter where you get it. Of course, this is also a non-age statement. So far I've mentioned to you the the small batch and the amber ale are both around 6 years old. This is between 11 to 27 years old. So it is a non-age statement, vatted single malt.
You mean there actually can be a bit of 27-year-old whiskey in this?
So yeah, predominantly the Oloroso sherry, which was distilled in 1991. And as far as I'm aware, could stand corrected, we are still drawing from these casks for our single malt, which is really interesting. In terms of money for value, it's also very accessible in terms of its price point. One other thing that I didn't mention was also the tropical fruits. So some of you might again get the likes of mango or pineapple, particularly, and I don't know if anybody does add water to your whiskey. If you do, that's absolutely fine. I'm not going to judge anybody for adding water or ice, but if you add a bit of water into your whiskey from the single malt, typically it can draw out a lot more of that pineapple notes. I have tested it with water in the past.
And I have a question. So if all this stock comes from Cooley, and I suppose that this is old stock, it's not like new stock that it was produced a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So if the youngest component is 11 years, why not put the age statement on the single? Let's say to state it as a 10-year-old or 11-year-old.
It's again, Andre, you're asking killer questions. It's really good. The honest answer is that we don't want the age to be the biggest signifier on the bottle. And you'll notice that for all of our core range, where we very much take the mentality of the actual contents of the bottle are more important on what age it says. Because you know yourself as a consumer, the minute you see 11 years on that bottle of whiskey, you're going to go in your head, okay, what 12-year-old, 11-year-old Irish single malt do I know? How does this compare in terms of price? Is this better? Is this worse? And we always do that without thinking. It's something that we've done historically as consumers, using age to define quality. And that's kind of the honest answer. Because if we put 11 on that bottle of whiskey, you would never know that there's elements that are up as far as 27 years old. And it doesn't do justice to the overall process. But it's a really, really good question.
But
I just finished. So am I assuming correctly that all the stock from Cooley is the old stock that you took when the Cooley distillery was sold, and you are not using the new stock, like, I don't know, 4-year-old whiskey from Cooley? This is all from the old stock?
Yes. So the one whiskey that we are going to be trying tonight that is 100% distilled in the Newmarket distillery in Dublin is the Black Pits. The second whiskey that we have that we don't have here tonight, which has been distilled in Dublin, is our single pot still.
Yeah.
So there are 2 releases at the moment as it stands. The thing about Teeling is because they're such an innovator, there's so much products all the time. So nearly the next time that I talk to you, this will probably have changed again. But at the moment, there's 2 releases from Dublin, except for our single casks. Behind Maris there, one of those single casks that you fill your own is distilled in Dublin. It's a single pot still, single cask. Did I see? Sorry, Roland, I think you had a question there.
Yeah. What I wanted to say is just regarding the NAS. You're considering that people would compare it or make some assumptions if they see a relatively young age. But with the NAS, don't you think that they might consider that it can be a 3, 4, 5-year-old whiskey and consisting of 80%?
Absolutely. No, you're dead right. There is that other side of the argument where it can be 5% of a 20-year-old and the rest is all 3 or 4. You're dead right. And I think what that comes down to is education. One of my biggest roles as a brand advocate is talking to people like yourselves and being 100% transparent and telling them about the whiskey, rather than me going, here's a 12-year-old, drink it, do you like it, go buy it. But you're right. Yeah, there is that downside to having NASs. Me personally, I think they both have their advantages, but I think that's very much the prerogative of Teeling as a company. It's their core range. They really want to focus on the quality of the spirit, which will constantly change and evolve. Whereas other ones that have a limited release that is only done once, and that is treated, I suppose, as a once-off, and that's why they have age statements on those. If that makes sense. But no, it's a good point. So out of interest, the single malt, any of you find it similar to something you've drank before, like a similar regional style, let's say? Because I've heard this particular tasting note a lot, and I'll be curious if you, for example, does it remind any of you of Highland single malts in general?
It actually does. It actually really does. I didn't want to say it, but when I tasted it, I was like, I've drank this before, but I know I didn't. It's like, it's very similar to something, but I can't quite put my finger on it, but it's very similar to something.
Like, again, I don't often make comparisons with other brands, but so many people are like, oh yeah, Dalmor. Like, and again, if we talk about the 12, imagine putting these side by side and having a 12 and 12 if this was on the bottle. And we will start to make those comparisons. But I think there's some of those fruity qualities, but also almost a grassiness as well that you find in the single malt that you'll find in some Highland single malts. So it's I think very different from most Irish single malts in that respect, particularly the wine influence having 5 wine casks. To me, it's just still absolutely crazy that he's taking so many different flavors and making it work. Like the fact it's not just all muddled in a glass, that is quite well balanced and quite well layered, I think really goes to show Alex's skill as a master distiller, master blender. So at this stage, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring you on a quick virtual tour. Now, I know it says if I hear virtual one more time in 2021, I'm turning off my laptop. Trust me on this, it'll give you a really good indication of how we actually operate. I do have to forewarn you, this is not the weather at the moment in Dublin. So it does currently not look like this, as it is not this sunny. But this is Teeling Whiskey Distillery that you can see here in front of you. So this area in Dublin, it's called the Liberties, a very important area for whiskey production, as I said, throughout the centuries. I'm going to bring you on through and just skip through the reception to bring you straight into the distillery. So I can show you some of the, I suppose, the most important things, the stills, our washbacks, how we actually operate. Unfortunately, one thing I can't bring to you through a screen is the smell of the distillery. But at the moment, it smells absolutely incredible. We're distilling predominantly single malt and single pot still. So in fact, 66% of our annual production is dedicated to single malt and single pot still. The other 33%, so the other third, is dedicated solely just to experimenting. So on different grain types, different yeast strains, different distillation techniques, every stage of the process. 33% is dedicated towards that. You'll also see that obviously we don't have our warehouses here in Dublin, and we don't do the malting on site. Now, the reason being is a very simple answer. There's not farms in Dublin. So it's actually quite difficult to, locally source any of your grains from Dublin. It's impossible. And a lot of our grains are coming from the south of Ireland at the moment, from a company called the Malting Company of Ireland. We also do source some of our more experimental grains from the UK in particular. So normally we distill about 500,000 LPA, about 500,000 litres. Again, we're not talking massive quantities, but it is still a substantial amount. After we get in all of our grain from the silos, so we're talking about 3 tons for every single batch. Usually we grind up our grain, and you'll notice we have a wet mill. So I'm sure, have many of you been to distilleries in Scotland before? Maybe just give me a show of hands if you have visited distilleries in Scotland, and I'll see who has been to. I'm just going to check your screens. Okay, nice. Michael, you have. Roland, you have. Cool. Okay, so a couple of you guys. So if you go to distilleries in Ireland and also in Scotland, in a lot of cases, you will actually see the mill in a separate room. Now, it's funny, Michael, that you mentioned you smelled the grist of the single malt. So you can see it right here in front of you, the mill. Normally, the mill is in another room because grist is very, very flammable. So for the safety of the workers, for the people on site, normally it's in a separate part of the building. If you were to use a wet mill, not only does this mean we can have every stage of the process in one area, but we can actually also experiment with grain that is very low on enzymes. So from a flavor discovery perspective, we can test out really interesting stuff. Wet mill sounds very complicated. It's basically just you add a bit of water, and that's essentially what a wet mill is. But for example, if we use chocolate malt, we have no issues with this, where we can basically do a pre-mash in our mill before we start the actual mashing process.
So compared to the Scotch whiskey process, you're skipping one stage, or are you just moving it one step ahead?
We're moving it one step behind if we are using, specialty grains. But apart from that, it's the exact same. Malting, milling, mashing, lautering, fermenting, all the rest of the jazz. But yeah, the exact same. So typically, with the lautering, there's nothing really too exceptional here. I'm not going to talk to you about the specs of our lauter tun. But one thing I think that is quite interesting is the fermenters. So we have experimented with loads of different types of yeast. Sake yeast, champagne, brewer's yeast. What we're using at the moment, and you may taste this in our next whiskey in the Dublin distilled liquids, is we're using white wine yeast. So white wine, again, it's coming from South Africa. It's a South African white wine yeast. It's going to add tropical notes, so passion fruit, pineapple, mango, maybe a bit of citrus, so that minerality. But you'll definitely taste that from the next whiskey we're trying. And also, if you ever get a chance to try our new make spirit, it does have a little bit of that fruity kind of winey elements. So we do a spontaneous or wild fermentation, wooden washbacks for about 24 hours. And then we transfer it over into steel for an additional 4 to 5 days. So again, really trying to change up every single stage of the process, not just looking at, say, the stills or the barrels. We're really starting from ground zero now in the last couple of years. Our stills, and I've just highlighted the one there, you'll notice are named very, very importantly. So we've got Alison on the left, Natalie in the middle, and Rebecca down the very, very end. These are the 3 daughters of Jack Teeling, one of the founders, of course, of Teeling Whiskey Company. So really nice idea, you know, naming it after his baby girls. It does go from oldest to youngest. So Alison, she gets the biggest pot still because she's the oldest. We all know how that works. Rebecca gets the smallest, being the youngest. And of course, as I said, our annual production is about 500,000 litres. So we do both double and triple distillation within a lot of our experimentation. The reason being is if you're using unusual grain types, of course, you're going to have to test out both to see which works better. You know, I'm sure you all know distillation typically strips a lot of the characteristics of the grains. The further you go on, the more you take away. The good side, though, is with triple distillation, you retain esters from fermentation. So if you're a company like Teeling who's using a very unusual yeast strain or is pushing the fermentation, that's going to carry through in the final spirit. So we do both double and triple distill. Now, before we move on with any of the techie stuff, because I know it's a lot of science and it's a lot to take in, we're going to jump back to a whiskey and we're going to try one of our brand new releases. As you can tell, I'm very, very excited about it. Being from Dublin, this is a Dublin distilled whiskey, our Teeling Black Pits, which I'm just going to pull up on my screen to show you the bottle because the design is absolutely beautiful.
So what does the name refer to?
So Black Pits, it's actually an area in Dublin. Originally, it's an area that's actually in the back of our distillery. It was very well known for tanneries in particular, so people who make leather. Apparently, the name comes from the fact that originally they built like pits or holes in the ground where they poured liquids to make leather. You know, I'm not a leather or tanner expert, but I think that makes a lot of sense as to where it's coming from. So yeah, an area in Dublin. There was also a lot of malting houses back in history in this area. So this is our first triple distilled peated single malt, 100% peat. Have a smell, have a taste. Enjoy, guys. Sláinte.
Do you know what was the ppm of the malt?
Yes.
You were expecting this question, right?
I was like, what's the ppm? Where's the peat coming from? And what's the typical third one? How is it peated, I suppose, sometimes, but that's still ppm. Yeah, so sorry, the short answer, Andre, is started at 55 ppm. So quite heavy, you know, quite smoky coming in at the start of the process. The interesting thing, as I said, about triple distillation is it reduces not only grain components, but also it reduces phenols. So it went all the way down as far as 15 in the final spirit. So it means it's going to be a light smoke rather than a heavy smoke. So yeah, 15 ppm.
And the age, I suppose it's somewhere around 4 or 5 years.
Exactly. We're looking around the 5-year mark for this. This was actually released last year. The reason I'm hesitant is because it came out in certain markets at different times, but I think it was roughly around between September to November is when we first released this. I see a couple of guys like Milos have a bottle at home. Nice. It's a beautiful bottle design. Like one thing I really like about it is it takes some of those traditional cues like the small kind of stout bottle. It almost looks a bit like Connemara, right? But at the same time, then the tubing is very modern, very kind of industrial looking, which I think is very cool. It's one of the first whiskies as well where we actually got every single component of the casing from different countries. So as you can imagine, it was an absolute nightmare to pull together with everything going on, not just with COVID, but with Brexit and everything else. Trying to get the whiskey finished, bottled, and labeled was a marathon. But I think worth the end result. So the first thing that I want to say is, I know when we talk about peated whiskey, often we tend to think of what we know. We think of peer comparisons. We think of Lagavulin, we think of Ardbeg, we think of Freud, Kilchoman, whoever is your go-to peated single malt. What I will try and say to you, don't go there. The reason being is that this is something that is entirely different. First and foremost, it is an Irish peated single malt, which is very different from a Scottish peated single malt. If we talk about just Islay, for example. But also, let's not forget, this is a Teeling peated single malt, which I hope, if you've learned from this evening so far, is always going to be a little bit left of center. The first thing that's different about it is how it's matured. So I hinted to it earlier. It is Sauterne. It's bourbon and Sauterne wine casks. The yeast is white wine yeast, wooden washbacks. And the peated malt itself is coming from Glenesk in Speyside. So we're talking less of an iodine, less of that medicinal smoke, and more of a kind of a barbecue smoke, which again is really interesting with triple distillation. Like if you think about it, you've got all that fruitiness and you've got this light barbecue smoke. We start to think of like barbecue foods, like grilled pineapples, cooked bananas, even like applewood, which is a very, very unusual but delicious peated single malt. So as always, let me know what you guys are tasting, what you're smelling. I'll be interested to hear. And if you are a big peat fan, like myself, feel free to give me a hands up. Nice. Anybody not like peated whiskies out of interest? It's completely fine if you're not. Yeah, Thomas, that's absolutely fine. I know plenty of people who aren't. And I think the interesting thing about this is it's definitely a really good entry as well into peated single malts. It's again very accessible.
It's definitely a great entry. It's what I wanted to tell because it's singularly heavy on the nose. You can definitely tell that it's peated, but if you taste it, it's very smooth. It's very easy to drink. For an entry-level peated whiskey drinker, is absolutely perfect.
Oh no, I'm delighted to hear. That's. I think obviously as our second release, it's something that we're always very nervous about when you present a product to anyone, whether it's your first whiskey or it's your 100th whiskey. But yeah, I agree with you in the palate. It's very smooth.
I also think that this is a very, very good starter for peated whiskey. And it's very good that this is Irish. And I think that this is much, much smoother than the Connemara.
Do you think so? Yeah. Yes. And what's interesting is the ppm is not far off. Some of the core range of Connemara, you're talking between, I'm trying to remember, is it 13 or is it 20 is the ppm? But give it either way, it's within the same realm of smokiness. Let's not forget as well, you're talking predominantly bourbon casks. Whereas for me, the Sauterne influence is key. It gives that apricot, honey, marzipan, a little bit of saltiness that all carries through in the palate. And this was something that we first discovered way back 6 years ago that we've been working on continuously.
I think compared to Connemara, this is sweeter and like more creamier, and not that strong peat blast like Connemara. I get a little bit of white chocolate, maybe coconut, a touch of citrus, vanilla, and it's very creamy, very, very smooth, and very. This is something very easy and dangerously easy to drink, I would say.
No, I think you're right. I agree with you, Andre.
I agree right there.
And now when I have the previous one, maybe that single malt, it's really a very, very good way from the single malt to the peated. So I can compare the single malt and this peated one, and it's really good to see the way how it goes from the single malt to the peated. And
yeah, so did many of you go back to the other whiskies and try them again?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have all of them here, and it's really interesting to compare them between. And the single malt and peated are completely different from the first two, but it's really nice to have them in
side by side. To have it
yes.
To have the opportunity to go back and forth and compare them.
I'm delighted to hear you've made my night, because you've no idea how much time and effort went into deciding, okay, we choose this whiskey, and what if it goes before that one? Or what if it goes at the end? Even not having the piece at the end, I think, was always going to be divisive, because I'm sure it's one of those ones when it's on a tasting, people think it has to be at the end. But again, if you're finishing up with the higher age statements, I often think it's best to leave it to the end. But yeah, I'm glad to hear that, Milos. With this particular one as well, let's not forget, you're saying the difference between, say, Connemara and Teeling. We are looking predominantly at double distillation versus triple distillation. So we have done experiments with our peated single malts double distilling. We've tried out a lot of cognac casks and bourbon as cask types for these double distilled peated single malts. And it's very interesting to see the comparison. Like, I have tasted, for example, double distilled with Sauternes, and it's completely different. You know, it's obviously a higher ppm, but there's something that it does in the palate where it loses that creaminess, which is very, very interesting. So me personally, as a peat fan, as much as a non-peated whiskey drinker, I hope, and I think I would be surprised if you don't see more peated whiskey from Teeling in the future. I think they're definitely going to wait, allow this to breathe and allow this to really take its time in the global whiskey market. But I think after that, you're definitely going to see, cask strengths, double distilled peated single malts, different cask types in these. I would be very surprised if you didn't see that down the line. And one thing I think is very interesting, if you think about it, this is our second whiskey distilled in Dublin. So imagine what our 30th or our 50th whiskey is going to be like. If our second whiskey is a triple distilled peated single malt, God only knows what the 30th and 50th are going to be like. Or this in 20 years, that's what interests me as well. Sorry, go ahead. Was it Michael, you had a question?
Hey, if you wanted to emphasize that this whiskey has a potential, you don't need to go anywhere. I mean, even this one has a really, really nice potential. And I'd be really interested to have it side by side with this like overhyped Islay whiskey and dilute it down to 46% and have it side by side with this one. And I think it would stand the test.
That's very nice of you to say. One thing I'm personally really looking forward to, and again, this all depends on the thing that I said I wouldn't talk about tonight, the elephant in the room. If we are allowed to travel again, I'm really looking forward to doing whiskey festivals. Because anytime someone comes up to a stand, and I've done hundreds of them at this stage, but anybody who comes up to a stand and they come to an Irish whiskey and they love peat, and what's the first thing they do? They go, "Oh, Irish." And they turn away. So I'm so excited to have a peated whiskey and go, no, come back. Here's a peated Irish whiskey for you. You can actually stay at the stand. So I'm looking forward to seeing the response of tastings in person. I've already seen it online. It's been immensely positive. And this particular whiskey has done very well locally, at a lot of the awards. But I'm very much looking to see it like a big setting, at a whiskey festival and see what people think of it.
I was actually quite surprised. I don't know if you remember, a few months back, we had the tasting together with the Waterford Whiskey Society, and we had Black Pits there as well. And
I do, yeah, it was good tasting.
The response for Black Pits was very, very good, which was quite surprising for me in terms of Irish whiskey drinkers, actually.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Thomas. Like, it's funny, the appetite for peated whiskey is so much less in Ireland than it is, say, for example, in some European countries. I think we're only starting to really come to terms with it. And the reason being is from the 1980s onwards, triple distilled blended Irish whiskey was the predominant style. And it's still, one of the biggest global exports around the world. So it's what we associate with the Irish whiskey category. Now, Teeling, our overall ethos, and I think you've probably heard me say this before, but our aim is really to challenge consumers like yourselves on how they understand Irish whiskey and show, what Irish whiskey can be pieces, and it can be matured in different cask types, and it can have, weird and wonderful ingredients. And it doesn't have to be just all about triple distillation or one component. The whiskeys we tried tonight are all triple distilled, but you probably have heard me. I haven't led with triple distillation as the only elements. To me, I very much believe each stage of the process is equally important. But you're right. I think it's getting more and more prominent. Like there's now, I think the most recent figure was around 18 producers looking at peated products. So that could be poaching, new make spirits. That could be vodka, it could be peated gin, peated whiskey. But there are approximately around 18 different producers looking at. So the good news is if you like peated whiskey and if you like the Teeling peated whiskey, it's not going to be the last one you see in your life from Ireland, I think is the point to take from that. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time just before we try the last whiskey. I'm sure some of you will probably want to have a bit of water, rinse out your palate. And to finish up with the process, obviously we have the maturation. So with our maturation process, as I said, we're not based in Dublin. This is just purely for show. It's about 50 kilometers from Dublin is where our warehouses are. Up there, as I mentioned to you earlier, we've got 100 different cask types. So to name you but a few, we have everything from gin casks, aquavit, tequila, cognac, armagnac, wine cask, rum cask, beer, so many different flavors down there. Think IKEA, but for whiskey drinkers. That's essentially what you're getting in the warehouse. Also in Ireland, of course, you are not limited to using just oak wooden barrels. So in Scotland, you have to use oak. Now that can be variations of oak. So you could use chinquapin, you could use Spanish oak, French oak, American oak, but it has to be oak wooden barrels. In Ireland, we can use pretty much any style of wood. So for example, Teeling has experimented with chestnut, acacia, cherry woods. Even most recently, we have tested out what's called ambarana. So ambarana, it's a Brazilian hardwood, typically used to make cachaça, which is a style of, I suppose, rum, if you will, made in Brazil. So lots of kind of unique flavors, not just coming from the type of barrel, but also from the type of wood itself. Now, the reason I'm homing in on these three barrels in particular, if you remember, our three pot stills are named Alison, Natalie, and Rebecca, after the three daughters of Jack. These two barrels here, Zoe and Holly, I don't know if you can see them through the bars. Zoe and Holly are Stephen Teeling's daughters. So these are actually whiskey maturing on site. It's the only whiskey we have maturing in Dublin. And supposedly Holly and Zoe will receive a barrel of whiskey when they turn 18. So fingers crossed they like whiskey, because if not, you're probably going to see it on the secondary market. But with the maturation, of course, in Ireland, similar to in Scotland, you don't lose a massive amount to angel share. Very temperate climate. It's quite a slow maturation. So it's not like, say, for example, in the States, or even, further afield, like in Israel, there's such a rapid maturation, but their losses are huge. And in Ireland and Scotland, we often say that we can pinpoint these flavors much easier because the maturation is a little bit slower. There's not going to be a drastic change from tasting a whiskey one day to the next, where you will see that, for example, in countries like I mentioned. I think a really good example of something that is just exceptionally well matured is the last whiskey we're going to try. So if you haven't done so already, please do take your time. If you have any other questions before we try the last whiskey, please feel free to interrupt me, and I'll give you time just to finish your black bits.
If I may, I actually wanted to ask, when you mentioned the 24-year-old, the Southern casks, that it actually evolved into the 28, and it soon will be the 32-year-old release. Like, is it already in the Southern cask, and is it maturing in Southern cask, or is it still in bourbon and it will be transferred again?
So it's actually already been bottled. It's no longer even in casks. But yeah, it was transferred originally into bourbon casks. Now what we did is, into Sauternes casks. What we did is we bottled up a number of that stock, but we kept a certain amount of liquid still maturing in Sauternes. So with the 28, for example, you are looking closer to 7 or 8 years in Sauternes. The 38, obviously, you've an even longer edition. And the idea is to see how it evolves. One thing I found really interesting is if you try the 24 and the 28, the peat is way less dominant in the 28. Obviously, because the Sauternes has had time to add sweetness and add fruits. But it's very interesting to see the difference between the two. And to think, with the 32-year-old, who will have what, nearly 10 years in Sauternes, is going to be incredible. I personally haven't tried it yet. I'm begging, borrowing, and stealing any samples that I can get my hands on, but very, very much looking forward to trying it when we do eventually release it. So it's something you can look forward to in the very near future. Obviously, the current climate permitting, and I'd say you will definitely see as well, as I mentioned, probably future releases using Sauternes and using peat. So the last one, sorry, go ahead, Andre. You look like you're about to ask a question.
So for the black peats, this is in the core range, so we can expect it for the upcoming years to be available, right?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention that. It's a good point to make. The black pits now, yes, is part of the core range. So this is not a limited release. You'll be able to get this going forward in the future. And similar, as I mentioned already, probably ad nauseum at this stage, in comparison to our other whiskies like the small batch or the single malt, that recipe will change and evolve and continue to be a non-age statement.
Okay, thank you.
So I got a question, if I may. So you're saying all the core range is based on batch versions. So all of them are going to change, or do you have one or two that's going to be like the same all the time? Like, let's say Glenfiddich, the 15, which is like the same recipe, pretty much like if you open a bottle from 10 years back, there will be differences a little bit, but they are trying to make it the same. With the Teeling, like you're saying, it's all like released in batches.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I think it just broke off at the end there, but what I did hear you, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that it will change over time for, let's say, 10 years from batch to batch, that it constantly evolves. Is that what you were saying?
Yes.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, I don't want you to misunderstand that we completely change the recipe and suddenly we do, let's say, 80% malt matured in beer casks, and that's still a small batch. We do try to keep a certain level of consistency. So we actually have, I can't remember the exact name for it. I think Alex calls it his master batch. And this is the very first release of the small batch. So what he does is he uses that as a template and then, does try to get that as close as he can as possible, but is still very much looking to improve on it. The way I often like to think about it is, I don't know if many of you are into cooking. I often use a kind of a bartending analogy. If you think about like the first old fashions you've ever made, probably it's going to be very different to the old fashions that you're making now, let's say 5, 10, however many years on. It's still the same ingredients, probably give or take. You might change up something minor, but the base recipe is still, more or less the same. We take that same mentality of how we make our whiskey. So we wanted to have a certain level of consistency, not completely different, but we're definitely not afraid to change it up and have it kind of go in a slightly different direction. For example, to give you, I think, probably a more clearer explanation is the rum. When we started off with the small batch, it was predominantly Spanish style, predominantly Flor de Caña. So coming from Nicaragua, obviously one very, very specific style of rum, where since then we've sort of branched out and looked a lot more towards like Jamaican high ester rum, a lot more towards other regions, which bring obviously a very different flavor profile. So I hope that answers your question. Was it Peter who asked that? I hope
yes. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
So I'm just going to show you the bottle of the last one, because again, I personally think that we do also lead with our eyes as much as our bellies. And the Renaissance 3 is a beautiful bottle. You can see it there. So this is part of a limited series, an 18-year-old single malt. This was actually replacing the first series that we ever did at Teeling. So when I started with Teeling Whiskey Company, we did not have all of these different products we're trying tonight. You know, it was literally the 3 here behind me and a couple of other limited releases. One of those limited releases was a series called the Revival series. So the idea was, you know, obviously reviving Dublin whiskey, the first new distillery. The Renaissance is kind of the next chapter in where we're at. So this has completely replaced that series. Now, this is the 3rd edition. If any of you are collectors, or if you just have a very, very decent whiskey collection, I can see, is it Madar? Just below my screen has a cracking whiskey collection there. There is 3 editions of these. So if you are looking to get your hands on the other ones, the first is matured in Madeira. The 2nd edition is matured in Australian Shiraz, so full-bodied red wine. And this one is Muscat, absolutely delicious. So regional French wine. Have a smell. I'm just checking how much I've left in my bottle. Just enough to taste. Pour it into your glass, have a taste, let me know what you think. So it's an 18-year-old single malt. We're talking roughly around 18 years, just over, in American bourbon barrels, and then a finish in Muscat.
This is amazing. I would say this is really, really amazing.
Wow, that's fantastic. Really.
This is red wine?
Wow.
Yeah, so it's French wine casks. Yeah, a red grape variety. But you can see why I left it to the end.
Damn. Damn.
I can definitely smell the grapes in here. But not like raisins, but the fresh grape, viney taste, and with exotic fruits like pineapple maybe.
Yeah, for me it's like it's grape must. You know, it's the grape must with a little bit of like a herbal, or like I think in the tasting notes they mentioned mint. For me personally, it's
eucalyptus. There is something like that in the tail.
That's the thing, Peter. Oh, you beat me to it. I was going to say eucalyptus. So for me, it's less mint, but I can understand what a lot of people say, like menthol. For me, it's
I'm
more.
loving the tail. I'm really loving the tail. The oily tail is awesome. It's something very special. This is a bottle I would buy and say like let's drink this, because this is something you need to taste. You need to experience. This is an experience at a bottle.
Absolutely,
Like,
and let's not forget, you know, there's not a massive amount of 18-year-old Irish single malts available. You know, not just in Slovakia, but around the world. It's I think more of a rarity. Like I always find it really interesting when you try Scottish. Let's just take single malts, and it's so commonplace to see 21, 30, maybe even younger, like 18, 16, 15. In Ireland, it's still quite a rarity. If you think about it, there was only 3 distilleries in the 1980s. If you do the maths, like there's not a massive amount of old stock in comparison, say, to Scotland. But I agree with you. This is like your special occasion whiskey. Me personally, I really enjoy it after a meal, like a digestif. Again, the wine influence works really well with any kind of desserts. If you are someone that likes to eat and kind of drink at the same time. But the mango notes are massive. I don't know if any of you went back to the amber ale, which, if you remember, a lot of those flavors are coming from the hops. Like it seems so much more beery, very kind of yeasty in comparison to the Renaissance 3. But there is those tropical notes in the amber ale as well.
I do have the amber ale still poured in my glass, and there are similarities. But what surprised me when I poured this 18-year-old in the glass, I smelled cherries. Now I do not.
Cherries,
they completely
nice.
left. Cherries, just for a couple of few minutes, but they completely gone, and now I smell maybe more fruits, mango, but the complexity and the taste is so huge and smooth. It's a brilliant whiskey.
It needs time.
Very elegant.
Yeah, a lot of time, a lot of smelling. You get a great variety out of it.
Yeah, I've noticed a lot of people smelling this for a decent amount of time. You kind of don't want to drink it nearly.
and that finish is really, really great because it changes it changes 3 times in a few seconds at the end. So it's really, really very nice.
It's very long and complex, definitely, and full-bodied. So there's a lot going on in here. You can smell this all night long, I think.
And I think it gives you a great understanding of, this, as I said, is our vintage reserve. You've tried kind of both sides of the coin, the younger stock that we've just distilled in Dublin, or that we've just released, I should say. That's been maturing for a couple of years, 4 or 5 years. And then the older stock that we're kind of recirculating and putting our own stamp, our own kind of Teeling twist on, if you will. So I think it's going to be very, very interesting at least definitely the next 5 years for Teeling. How they develop as a brand is going to be exciting, in the sense of we are obviously depleting the stock the more and more bottlings that we do from the Cooley Reserve. But I think the newer stuff as well, and I think you mentioned it, Michael, so much promise. Like, I would happily drink the Black Pits and the Renaissance side by side. They're very different. They're completely like oranges and apples. But I think both are unique in their own sense.
As a brand ambassador, I think you did a very good job, because, for example, I'm not that familiar with the Irish whiskey, and this is basically one, like me getting into it, and I'm just amazed. I'm really amazed, and you got me, with the second sample, not with the
not the first
one. I'm really like
I'm only joking with you.
Come on. No, I tasted that one before, and the first time I had it was after a hike, in like a weekend trip or something, and I wasn't really like focusing. I was like, yeah, small batch, why not? This small sample. But this was my second time with the small batch, and I improved my image of that whiskey as well. So.
That's very kind of you to say that. Thank you very much. That's always really nice to hear. Me personally, I love what I do, and I think if you love what you do, you don't work a day in your life. Is the old cliche, but it's always nice to hear. So thank you. And I'm hoping that for some of the rest of you, the core range as well, revisiting it or trying it for the first time, I hope opened your eyes now that you have a bit more of an understanding of how it's made. As I said, the whiskies we've tried tonight are very much kind of a splash of different areas that we're looking at. One that I would love to present to you guys in the distant future is some of the grain innovations that we're looking at. So the likes of the chocolate malt, the crystal rye, some of these very, very unusual mash bills that you've probably never even heard of before. I think is the future of Teeling. And also the future of Irish whiskey. We're looking at a lot of terroir. We're looking a lot at grain, at mash bills in Ireland at the moment, as well as all other areas. So I suppose to put the gun to your head, so to speak, if you have to have either a favorite, you can say favorites. So if you have a couple ones that you like, feel free to say. Please let me know. Maybe type in the comments will be easier rather than everyone speaking at the same time. Or if you prefer, we can just do a number count. So anybody for volume or for small batch number 1, just give me a 1 for anybody, and I'll do a count. As I said, you can have more than one favorite if you do like amber ale. So number 2, which was the beer finish. Okay, nice. Okay, I'm just going to take a note. We'll do a little overall. So single malt, which was aged in 5 different wine influences: white wine, Burgundy, Cabernet Sauvignon, Madeira Port, and Oloroso Sherry. Okay, I'm trying to keep count here. Hopefully I'll put up the right number of fingers after 5 whiskies. Number 4, Black Pits, our first peated single malt. Nice, oh cool. So there's actually a good variety here. And the last one, I think some of you put in the comments as well, the Renaissance Volume 3. It's killer, yeah. It's a very, very good whiskey. I think we probably have a winner, but it was a close one. Renaissance 3. 2 votes for place 2. Oh, nice. Yeah, so that is all the whiskies from Teeling. I suppose just to wrap it up for myself, I want to say honestly, thank you all so much for your time. It was such a pleasure to meet you and talk, even if it is online. I really enjoyed it. So I hope you learned a bit about Teeling and Irish whiskey. It goes without saying that if you ever get a chance to come to Dublin or Ireland, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. I'm sure you can get my email, my contact details from Andre. I will more than happily roll out the red carpet for any of you. And likewise, I hope to see you in person over in Slovakia in the near future. So again, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice evening, everybody.
It was really
awesome.
It was very good.
Thank you very much. It was really very interesting.
Cheers, guys. Thank you. So I will let you go, and if you do have any final questions, now is your time. If not, I will leave you to enjoy the rest of your evening, because I see there's a couple of people who it's getting black in the backgrounds. But if you do have anything you want to know about, now's your chance. Otherwise, I'll let you go.
May I ask, have you already tried something from the tequila casks?
From any whiskey brand?
From the Teeling, from the tequila ones.
From Teeling, yes, but it was a very, very long time ago. So the last, well, not too long ago. The last time I was in the warehouses was last month. Didn't get a chance to try it then. Since then, the last time I was in the warehouses now, because of everything that's going on, is now nearly about 2 years. So as you can imagine, that's a really long time for whiskey to change. So I honestly, I don't remember what it tasted like. It's been too long, and it just goes to show you need to be up there regularly to be tasting the products. There's a couple of other ones as well in Ireland. If you want to have a look for them, it's not the only tequila influenced Irish whiskey, but something I think that could be very exciting. It's a big thing now in Scotland as well. Like in Scotland, they can now use agave-based spirits, so Sotol, Mezcal, tequila. You'll start to see it become a bit of a fad.
Now, if I may, just one quick question. Sorry.
Yeah, sure, Gabriel. Go ahead.
It's okay. Go ahead.
Okay, so I have a question. Is you or Robert planning to go to the Budapest or the Prague Whiskey Festival?
Myself or Robert? It's a very good question. I think if it was up to myself or Rob, we would say yes every day and just want to go to everything. I think at the moment, look, we're playing it by a case-by-case basis. We have gotten, some sign-off for trips in 2021. But we still need to take it very much at a slower pace and really, I suppose, focus on business critical trips. So the short answer is right now, we don't know. I hope that one of us will be present. I was there, God, how many years ago now? Would it be 2-3 years ago? But short answer, I couldn't tell you, Gabriel. I hope we are. If we are, save a dram for you at the stand.
If yes, we will see each other there.
Absolutely, yeah. But yes, I'll let you go, guys. Thank you again for your time and enjoy your evening. As I said, feel free to reach out to me after this. I'm more than happily get in contact with you. As long as it's not like a 3 a.m. drunken phone call, I won't accept that. See you all. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.